January 17, 1944, 20,000 feet above the frozen plains of northern Germany. The air at this altitude is not merely cold. It is a physical presence, a hostile force that seeps through layered flight suits and leather gloves, turning fingertips numb and breath into crystalline clouds inside oxygen masks. Lieutenant Charles Brown sits in the cockpit of his B-17 Flying Fortress, Ye Old Pub, surrounded by the mechanical symphony of 4 Wright Cyclone engines, each one a thundering heartbeat of American industrial might, each revolution pulling his wounded bomber through skies that have become a killing field. Through the fractured plexiglass of his cockpit window, he can see the contrails of the formation ahead, white ribbons dissolving into the winter void. Behind him, 3 of his crew are wounded. Below him, the patchwork of German countryside spreads like a map of enemy territory where every village, every field, every crossroad represents potential death. And in this moment, suspended between the earth and the stratosphere, Lieutenant Brown makes a decision that defies every instinct, every hour of training, every rational calculation of survival. He reaches forward and begins shutting down his engines. The logic of aerial warfare in 1944 is brutal and mathematical. A bomber without power is a falling coffin. A pilot who cuts his engines over enemy territory is committing suicide. Yet Brown's gloved hand moves with deliberate precision across the control panel, pulling back throttles, watching tachometers wind down, feeling the vibration of his aircraft change from aggressive roar to an eerie gliding whisper. This is not panic. This is not mechanical failure. This is a calculated gamble born from the cruel education of modern warfare, a lesson written in the wreckage of thousands of aircraft, in the frozen bodies of airmen who never made it home, in the documented fact that in the winter of 1943-44, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers and crew at a rate that made each mission a statistical death sentence. To understand why a trained pilot would deliberately kill his engines in the heart of enemy airspace, one must first understand the industrial hell of the strategic bombing campaign over Germany. By January 1944, the combined bomber offensive had transformed the skies over Europe into what airmen grimly called Flak Alley, a 3-dimensional battlefield where German anti-aircraft batteries and fighter squadrons had evolved into a killing machine of terrifying efficiency. The 8th Air Force, based in England, was sending hundreds of heavy bombers deep into German territory daily, each formation a floating fortress of aluminum and courage, each mission costing an average of 5 to 10% of the attacking force. The mathematics were unforgiving. Aircrew were required to complete 25 missions to finish their tour, yet the statistical probability of surviving 25 missions hovered around 30%. Every man who climbed into a B-17 understood he was more likely to die than to see home again. The B-17 Flying Fortress itself embodied American industrial philosophy, massive, robust, bristling with defensive armament, 13 50 caliber machine guns, 4 engines capable of producing 4,800 horsepower, the ability to carry 8,000 pounds of bombs deep into enemy territory. It was called a fortress not from arrogance but from necessity, because the daylight precision bombing doctrine demanded that these aircraft fly in broad daylight, in tight formation, through concentrated enemy fire to deliver their payloads on strategic targets. The theory was elegant. Mass formations of heavily armed bombers could defend themselves through coordinated firepower, achieving air superiority through sheer firepower and numbers. The reality was carnage. German fighters, particularly the Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109, had evolved tactics, specifically to destroy B-17s, head-on attacks that exploited the fortress's relatively weak forward armament, concentrated fire on engines and cockpit, coordination with ground-based flak batteries that could throw up walls of exploding steel at precise altitudes. Lieutenant Charles Brown had learned these lessons not from manuals but from experience. By January 1944, he had flown multiple missions over Germany, had watched bombers beside him disintegrate into clouds of debris, had seen parachutes blossom like funeral flowers against the winter sky, had returned to base with his own aircraft holed by shrapnel and cannon fire. The mission on this particular day, a strike against industrial targets in Bremen, had gone catastrophically wrong from the start. Ye Old Pub had been hit by flak over the target, losing an engine and suffering structural damage that made the aircraft handle like a wounded animal. Then came the fighters, sleek predators that singled out damaged bombers the way wolves isolate wounded prey. The crew had fought back with desperate ferocity, gun barrels overheating, shell casings cascading through the fuselage, the acrid smell of cordite mixing with hydraulic fluid and blood. They had shot down at least one attacker, possibly two, but the cost was severe. 3 crew members wounded, oxygen system compromised, hydraulics failing, and worst of all, they had fallen behind the formation. A bomber alone in German airspace was already dead. It simply hadn't finished dying yet. Without the protective firepower of the formation, a solitary B-17 became easy prey for fighter squadrons that prowled the bomber routes like sharks following a blood trail. Brown knew this. Every man in his crew knew this. They could see other stragglers in the distance, trailing smoke, losing altitude, becoming statistics. The normal procedure in such circumstances was to maintain maximum power, to coax every possible mile per hour from the remaining engines, to run for the relative safety of the North Sea, where German fighters were less likely to follow, where air-sea rescue might have a chance of picking up survivors if they had to ditch. Maximum power meant maximum noise, maximum heat signature, maximum visibility, everything that made an aircraft a beacon for enemy fighters scanning the sky for wounded prey. This is where Lieutenant Brown's decision becomes radical, even incomprehensible by conventional wisdom. He had noticed something during previous missions, a pattern in how German fighters located and attacked stragglers. The Luftwaffe pilots were hunting by sound and visual signature, the distinctive roar of Wright Cyclone engines at full throttle, the vibration of a struggling bomber pushing its remaining engines to the breaking point, the telltale smoke trails of an aircraft burning excess fuel trying to maintain speed and altitude. Brown understood that he was flying a beacon, that every revolution of his remaining engines was essentially broadcasting his position to every fighter squadron within 50 miles. And so, in one of the most counterintuitive acts of survival in aerial warfare history, he chose silence over speed, stealth over power. The process of shutting down engines on a damaged bomber at 20,000 feet is not a simple matter of turning a key. Each engine represents not just propulsion but electrical power, hydraulic pressure, heating for the crew in sub-zero temperatures. Brown couldn't shut down all engines. That would indeed be suicide, but he could shut down the undamaged engines, leaving only the smoking damaged engine running at minimal power, just enough to maintain electrical systems and provide a whisper of forward momentum. The aircraft immediately began to descend, but this was calculated, controlled, a glide ratio that extended their range, even as it reduced their visibility and noise signature. Ye Olde Pub transformed from a roaring, obvious target into something resembling a gliding ghost, a shadow slipping through the winter sky at an altitude where German fighters typically concentrated on the main bomber streams. What Brown and his crew experienced next was a form of warfare most airmen never encountered, the warfare of absolute vulnerability met with absolute silence. The cockpit, usually dominated by engine noise so loud it made thought difficult, became almost quiet. Just the whisper of wind over damaged aluminum, the occasional creak of stressed airframe, the shallow breathing of wounded men in the back. The temperature, no longer moderated by engine heat, plummeted toward the ambient -40 degrees of high altitude. Ice began forming on interior surfaces. The crew, unable to move freely because of wounds and because any shift in weight could affect the delicate glide ratio, simply endured. Time became elastic, meaningless, each minute stretching into an hour of waiting for the burst of cannon fire that would announce their discovery, each successful mile a minor miracle that defied statistical probability. German fighter pilots in early 1944 were not the inexperienced recruits of later war years but veterans who had survived years of combat on multiple fronts. They flew aircraft that were technological marvels. The Focke-Wulf 190 could reach 426 miles per hour, climbed to 20,000 feet in under 10 minutes, and carried 4 20mm cannons capable of shredding a bomber's aluminum skin like paper. These pilots hunted in coordinated packs, communicating by radio, guided by ground controllers who tracked bomber formations, with radar, directed to interception points with mathematical precision. They expected targets that behaved predictably, bombers that ran at maximum power, that stayed at altitude, that followed standard escape routes toward England. They had developed an almost predatory instinct for finding stragglers, an ability to spot the telltale signs of a wounded bomber from miles away, uneven engine exhaust, erratic flight paths, the desperate speed of an aircraft pushing beyond its design limits. Lieutenant Brown's silent glide violated all these expectations. As Ye Olde Pub descended through 18,000 feet, then 15,000, sliding northwest toward the coast, German fighter patrols passed within visual range multiple times, dark crosses against winter clouds, predators on the hunt. but they were hunting for the sound and fury of desperation, not the whisper of controlled descent. Fighter pilots scanned the sky at their own altitude and above, looking for contrails and engine exhaust. A bomber gliding silently below, engines barely turning over, presented a signature that didn't register as threat or target. It looked more like debris, like a dead aircraft already falling, not worth the ammunition to confirm the kill. This psychological camouflage, this exploitation of enemy expectations, represented a form of tactical innovation born not from doctrine, but from desperation and insight. The historical record shows that throughout the strategic bombing campaign, innovation most often came from aircrews themselves, men who survived by observing, adapting, creating solutions that training manuals never anticipated. The 8th Air Force lost 4,754 bombers in combat over Europe, each loss representing 10 highly trained crew members, hundreds of hours of training, millions of dollars in equipment. Yet, for every loss, there were lessons learned and disseminated through the brutal educational system of actual combat. Pilots learned that tight formation flying, while defensive in theory, could also mean that flak claimed multiple aircraft with single bursts. They learned that fighter attacks followed patterns that could be anticipated and exploited. They learned that the rigid adherence to procedure could be as deadly as the enemy, that survival sometimes required violating every rule, trusting instinct over instruction, choosing the impossible over the merely suicidal. As Ye Olde Pub continued its ghost-like journey across German-occupied territory, Brown faced another crisis. The wounded engine, running at minimal power, was overheating dangerously. Smoke streamed from the cowling, visible evidence that would draw attention if any fighters came close. The hydraulic system was failing, meaning landing gear and flaps might not deploy when they finally reached England. 3 crew members were in serious condition, one potentially dying from internal injuries. The navigator, working with blood-stained maps and damaged instruments, calculated they had perhaps 30 minutes of glide time before they would be too low to clear the North Sea crossing, too low to reach the English coast. Every minute brought them closer to safety, but also closer to the inevitable moment when silence would no longer protect them, when they would have to restart the shutdown engines and hope they fired. Hope they produced enough power to climb away from the wave tops. Hope that German coastal defenses didn't catch them at their most vulnerable. Then came the encounter that would transform this already extraordinary mission into one of the most documented and debated incidents of the air war. At approximately 14,000 feet, descending through broken clouds somewhere over the German-Dutch border, Lieutenant Brown spotted a fighter climbing toward them from below, a Messerschmitt Bf 109, its distinctive profile unmistakable, its approach angle indicating the pilot had spotted them. This was the end of the silence strategy. Brown's hand moved to restart the shutdown engines, knowing it would take precious seconds for them to fire and build power, knowing that in those seconds they would be defenseless. But before he could engage the starters, something unprecedented occurred. The Bf-19 pulled alongside, not into attack position but into formation position, close enough that Brown could see the German pilot's face through the cockpit canopy, could see the pilot looking directly at him, assessing the damage to the American bomber, seeing the wounded aircraft for what it was, already dead by any rational measure, held together by hope and determination alone. The German pilot was Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe veteran with 27 confirmed kills, a recipient of the Knight's Cross, an experienced fighter ace who had survived 3 years of combat including the brutal skies over North Africa and Russia. By doctrine, by duty, by the mathematical logic of aerial warfare, Stigler should have destroyed Ye Olde Pub with a single firing pass. A bomber at this altitude, this damaged, this slow, was not even a challenge. It was target practice. One 2-second burst from his cannons would have torn through the crippled aircraft, adding another kill to Stigler's record, eliminating an enemy bomber that had just dropped explosives on German cities. Instead, Stigler did something that violated his training, his orders, and the savage logic of total war. He escorted the damaged American bomber toward the coast, flying formation on their wing, waving off other German fighters who approached to investigate, using his presence to shield Ye Olde Pub from attack. This act of mercy, though Stigler himself would later resist that term, insisting it was honor, not mercy, requires understanding the complex moral landscape of the air war. Fighter pilots, unlike bomber crews, engaged in individual combat, saw the faces of their enemies, operated in a realm where the conventions of chivalric warfare had not been entirely extinguished by industrial killing. There existed, particularly in the early and middle years of the war, an unspoken code among some pilots. You did not shoot men in parachutes, You did not strafe lifeboats. You acknowledged a worthy opponent's courage even as you tried to kill him. This code was inconsistent, often violated, certainly not universal. The air war produced countless acts of brutality and terror. But it persisted in individual pilots who maintained a distinction between legitimate military targets and what they perceived as defenseless victims. Stigler saw in the damaged B-17 something that triggered this code. The aircraft was so thoroughly destroyed, the crew so obviously desperate, that finishing them would not be combat but execution. He later recalled seeing the face of the tail gunner, slumped over his guns, either dead or unconscious. He saw the hydraulic fluid streaming from the fuselage, the gaping holes in the aluminum skin, the barely turning propeller of the damaged engine. He made a calculation that Brown had made earlier, a calculation that defied doctrine in favor of a deeper principle. For Brown, that principle had been adaptive survival. For Stigler, it was something else, the recognition that warfare, even total warfare, could not completely extinguish humanity without destroying the warrior himself. The escort continued for several minutes that stretched into subjective hours for the American crew. Stigler gestured toward Sweden, the neutral country that represented sanctuary for damaged bombers that could reach it. Internment but survival. Brown shook his head, pointing toward England, home base, the only acceptable destination. Stigler nodded, understanding the pilot's obligation to his crew and aircraft. When they reached the North Sea coast, Stigler waggled his wings in the universal pilot's salute, then peeled away, diving back toward German airspace before British coastal defenses could engage him. He never filed a combat report for this encounter, knowing that admitting he had spared an enemy bomber could result in court-martial and execution. The incident should have ended there, buried in the chaos of war, another untold story among millions. Lieutenant Brown restarted his shutdown engines over the North Sea. They fired miraculously, producing just enough power to keep ye old pub above the waves, to drag the shattered bomber across the water toward the English coast. The crew, those still conscious, understood they had experienced something. Beyond the normal calculus of combat, though they couldn't fully process it, survival consumed all attention. They made landfall over England with fuel tanks nearly empty, hydraulics completely failed. Brown executed a wheels-up belly landing at the first available airfield, the aircraft sliding across grass in a shower of sparks and torn metal before finally stopping. When the crew was extracted, when the wounded were evacuated to hospital, when maintenance personnel examined ye old pub, the assessment was unanimous. The aircraft should never have made it home. The damage was so extensive that the bomber was scrapped rather than repaired. It had delivered its crew to safety and had nothing left to give. The official mission report filed by Lieutenant Brown was standard operational documentation: targets attacked, damage sustained, casualties reported. He mentioned being shadowed by an enemy fighter, but, perhaps sensing the improbability of the truth, did not elaborate on the escort. The strategic bombing campaign continued with relentless intensity. By war's end, more than 350,000 American and British airmen had flown combat missions over Europe. Over 80,000 did not return. The 8th Air Force alone suffered 26,000 killed in action, a casualty rate that exceeded even infantry units in sustained combat. These numbers represented the cost of a doctrine that insisted on daylight precision bombing, that accepted horrific losses as necessary to destroy Germany's industrial capacity, that turned young men into statistical probabilities measured in completed missions versus probable death. For 46 years, the encounter existed as personal memory for Brown and Stigler, unknown to history, unexamined by scholars of aerial warfare. Brown returned to combat, completed his required missions, survived the war. Stigler continued flying for the Luftwaffe until Germany's collapse, survived multiple aircraft losses, transitioned from hunter to hunted as Allied air superiority became absolute. After the war, both men returned to civilian life, Brown in America, Stigler eventually immigrating to Canada. They did not speak of their encounter, had no way to contact each other, existed in separate spheres shaped by the same conflict. Then, in 1990, Brown placed a notice in a newsletter for former Luftwaffe pilots, describing the encounter, seeking the identity of the German pilot who had spared his life. The notice included specific details: date, location, aircraft markings, the visual memory of a pilot's face seen across 30 yards of winter sky. Stigler, now living in Canada, saw the notice and recognized his own actions. He contacted Brown. The two men met, compared memories, confirmed the impossible truth. Both had survived. Both had carried this moment through decades of peacetime. Both had wondered about the man on the other side of that encounter. Their subsequent friendship became documented history. Interviews, a book, television appearances. Historians examined the incident as a case study in the persistence of honor in total war. Psychologists analyzed the decision-making under extreme stress. Veterans of aerial combat recognized the encounter as emblematic of tensions between duty and humanity that defined the air war experience. Brown and Stigler, in their 70s when they reunited, had become something beyond former enemies. They were witnesses to each other's character, validators of each other's wartime choices, proof that even in industrialized killing, individual moral agency persisted. But the deeper significance of their encounter lies not in the touching reunion story, but in what their decisions reveal about the nature of survival and choice in modern warfare. Brown's decision to shut down his engines represented tactical innovation born from observation and desperate calculation, a rejection of doctrine in favor of adaptive thinking. His choice was not heroic in the traditional sense, it was pragmatic, calculated to exploit enemy patterns and expectations. It succeeded not because it was brave, but because it was unexpected, because it transformed his aircraft from obvious target into psychological camouflage. This kind of innovation, this willingness to violate procedure when procedure became death sentence, characterized the best survivors of aerial combat. They were rule breakers who understood that rigid adherence to doctrine worked only when conditions matched doctrinal assumptions, and combat rarely cooperated. Stigler's decision, conversely, represented the persistence of individual moral judgment even within a totalitarian military system fighting a war of annihilation. He was not a resistor, not secretly opposed to the Nazi regime. He was a professional warrior executing his duty until the moment that duty conflicted with his internal code. His choice to spare Brown's crew was not driven by sympathy for the Allied cause or doubt about German victory. It was driven by his conception of legitimate warfare, his distinction between combat and murder. This distinction existed in tension with Nazi ideology, which explicitly rejected such limits, which embraced total war as total destruction. That Stigler maintained this distinction while serving in Hitler's military, that he risked court-martial to honor it, demonstrates how individual character could resist systemic brutality even while operating within that system. Together, their decisions illuminate a profound truth about industrial warfare, that even in conflicts fought with machines, even in aerial combat where enemies are reduced to silhouettes and range calculations, human choice persists. The bomber crew who lived because their pilot shut down engines represented American industrial ingenuity applied at individual level, the same adaptability that allowed the United States to outproduce the Axis powers, the same pragmatic problem-solving that characterized American warfare. The fighter pilot who violated orders to spare an enemy represented something older and more ambiguous, warrior honor that transcended national ideology, recognition of common humanity that survived immersion in dehumanizing conflict. The engines that Brown shut down at 20,000 feet were not merely mechanical assemblies, but symbols of American industrial power. Each Wright Cyclone engine represented 28,000 precision parts, manufactured in factories employing hundreds of thousands of workers, assembled with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, capable of continuous operation in conditions that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. That Brown trusted his life to silence rather than power, that he chose stealth over American industrial thunder, represents tactical sophistication that transcended simple patriotic faith in American superiority. Survival required not just machines but the intelligence to use them unconventionally, the courage to trust counterintuitive reasoning over comforting doctrine. The frozen sky over Germany in January 1944 was arena for competing systems. American industrial capitalism versus German militarized fascism, daylight precision bombing versus coordinated air defense, the individual aircrew's survival instinct versus strategic objectives worth dying for. In that sky, thousands of young men fought and died according to patterns established by generals and politicians. But in singular moments, individual choices created exceptions to the pattern. Brown chose silence. Stigler chose mercy. Both survived to become old men who shared their story, who transformed private memory into historical record, who demonstrated that warfare, however industrial and brutal, never completely eliminated human agency. The lesson extends beyond aerial combat, beyond World War II, into fundamental questions about violence and choice. Modern warfare, particularly since 1914, has been characterized by industrialization, Mass armies, mechanized killing, strategic bombing, eventually nuclear weapons. This industrialization tends to abstract warfare into statistics and objectives, transforming individual soldiers into units of force, enemy populations into targets, moral questions into operational planning. Yet the Brown-Stigler encounter suggests that this abstraction is never complete, that individuals retain the capacity to choose honor over expedience, mercy over tactical advantage, humanity over dehumanization. These choices do not stop wars, do not change strategic outcomes. World War II continued with undiminished ferocity, regardless of one pilot's mercy. But they preserve something essential, the possibility that warriors can fight without becoming monsters, that enemies can recognize each other's humanity without ceasing to be enemies. Lieutenant Brown landed his shattered bomber on English soil and walked away in 50 more years of life. Oberleutnant Stigler landed his fighter on German soil and continued fighting a war already lost. Both carried with them the memory of minutes shared in hostile sky, a moment when warfare paused, when the machinery of killing acknowledged a limit. That moment, forgotten for decades, eventually became testimony, evidence that even in total war, totality has exceptions, that human choice persists in the most mechanized and brutal circumstances. The sky at 20,000 feet is still hostile, still unforgiving of error, still the realm where American bombers and their descendants patrol the world. But in January 1944, in that frozen emptiness above Germany, one pilot chose silence over power, another chose mercy over duty, and 10 men who should have died went home instead. Their survival was improbable, their reunion impossible, their story a reminder that warfare, however inevitable and necessary it may seem, never entirely escapes the moral agency of the individuals who wage it. The engines shut down not because they failed, but because a pilot understood that sometimes. Survival requires embracing vulnerability, that the roar of power can be a beacon for death, that in the calculus of combat, silence can be stronger than thunder.